Do, 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 do. Welcome to the Friends with Benefits podcast, a business podcast about revenue-generating partnerships, not a podcast about business time with friends. We're your co-hosting couple. I'm Jason.
And I'm Sam. Welcome to the show, friends.
Welcome back, everybody, especially Sam. Welcome back into the co-host seat. It was really fun having you as the guest
Glad
week.
to be back in this seat.
Yeah, that's not the hot seat. We got somebody else in the hot seat this week, and actually pretty stoked about this week's guest in conversation. Vaughn is a fairly new friend of mine. We actually got to meet in person at Catalyst the other week, which was great. Really looking forward to having him join us today. SVP of Global Partnerships at Mindmatrix, an outdoor adventurer, multiple-time award-winning grandfather, apparently, which is wild to me, and just an overall good dude who's kind of sharing the same love and passion for relationships and people as we do. So welcome to the show, Vaughn Mordecai.
It's great to be here. Glad to be here.
This is awesome.
And I've got a lot of grandkids. They're like,
I love it, man.
Yeah.
7X on the LinkedIn profile.
Yeah, 7 of them. I'm deceptively old.
Yeah, you don't look old enough to be a grandfather.
Yeah,
let alone times 7.
It's away from you.
Yeah, got started really early. We'll call it that. So, well, man, we're stoked for today's conversation. Appreciate you taking some time to hang out with us. We like to start the show out by getting some context around thoughts on the name. So, what does Friends with Benefits mean to you in the context of business partnerships?
That's an interesting question, because I think that it's a lot better to work with people that I like. It's funny how far some of this follows you. I've got friends all over the world now from different work and different things that I've done, and you just totally anticipate working with them again in the future, and you stay connected, and it's a very different environment than when my dad was working.
Right.
It's a lot of fun. Enjoy it. And, it's really cool just to meet people in different places at different times and just totally different environments than you'd ever imagine here sitting in Phoenix. So really cool.
Absolutely. And that opportunity to build community with those people that we get to work with, throughout the career is part of the fun. I joke that I've had 4 careers in my time, but I've done a pretty good job of maintaining that community throughout and trying to find ways to continue to weave it in and out of the work that I do.
Yeah. And, and the funny thing is that these partnerships that we get into, they quickly become friendships. And then you just don't know what you'd do without them. I was at that Catalyst event, and I looked around, and I thought, I finally found my people. They're all here at one place at one time. It's like a gigantic sort of basement party, but it was really kind of strange. But yeah, I mean, it's all of my partners, and you just hang out, and man, it's just like having a good friend over.
Absolutely. No, I love that.
So I want to dive into your background for a second, because we've talked about this on the show before, but people who find themselves in partnerships come from all walks of life. But you are the first of your kind that we've talked to, I believe. So you have a degree in sociology.
Yeah.
First, can you quickly explain what that is to our listeners?
Yeah. It's the study of how, and my bachelor's degree is in psychology. So I got in there to figure out why all the people around me were mental. And then I quickly realized it wasn't them. That it was me. And that, you just kind of, I started really enjoying studying people and how they interact with each other and what makes them tick. And you start to understand how the world works just a little bit better. And, reality was I graduated with psychology and went, what am I going to do with this? So I better go back to graduate school. And, the intuitive person in me said, maybe I should go into sociology, the one place that might be even harder to find a job than psychology. So I did research for a couple of did research as much as I could for that time in my role there, and then found that I really enjoyed the research side of it. And I was living in Idaho, and the thing that they do best in Idaho, other than farm, is that they're storing spent nuclear fuel. Okay, and
That's a new one.
I am not good at that. You don't want to put me in charge of that. So I had to move. I had to move out of the motherland to somewhere where I could get a job doing some research, and eventually it just led into doing research on partnerships. And that was my stumble point into channel and partnerships and things like that. So it was cool.
Okay, I have so many questions.
Yeah.
So what, like, young Vaughn, what encouraged young Vaughn to study this and choose this as your field?
Yeah, it's there was a really cool professor in the university that I was in, and he's published a whole bunch of books. And at the time, he was doing a whole bunch of research around how people define their world with the language that they use, and how that changes the sociological makeup of the world around them. Mm-hmm. So at the time, there were a lot of, this is horrible, it's horrible, but there were a bunch of white supremacists in Idaho.
Yep.
And he went and studied these guys to figure out how they teach each other how to hate, because it's all learned behavior. Mm-hmm. And the flip side of that is that you can teach each other how to love, right?
Right.
And I found what he was doing just fascinating. And so we applied a lot of those principles to suicide, actually. And
wow,
it was really, really interesting to just try to figure out what makes people tick. And it ended up, for me, I focused on social psychology. It was sort of, how language and how meaning in people's lives actually turn to define the experiences that they have, and how society and how their own, upbringing and things like that come to define their reality. Because when all is said and done, it's all about learning and societal impact. In most cases, there is biology in a lot of it, but at the end of the day, people define the world that they're in. Mm-hmm. And how does that happen? And so I was really fascinated with it, and that's how I ended up studying that for so long.
Okay, so there's
fascinating.
I have to let the listeners and you in on this one. There's a private Slack going on between Jason and I just texted him and said, I don't want to talk about partnerships. I want to talk about this.
Yeah. It was pretty cool. I mean, on the bookshelf behind me, I've got this book called This Thing Called Darkness. And it's how people start to define who they hate, who they love, how they rationalize war, how they rationalize what they fight against. The guy is probably having a heyday actually right now with all of the political back and forth that goes on in our country, because it's all so much of it is rhetoric and made up, and it doesn't even matter what you're attached to. It's which you can see from the stuff that I write, right? Like about artificiality and how that sort of it makes its way into so much that I write about, and the stuff that I post up about, actually.
Wow, I'm so intrigued by this. I've been doing like a lot of reading and studying and consuming so much content on this. It all shows up in different levels, different language, but you're so right. Like literally all of it's made up, and the way that we each approach the world as individuals, like right now, we're all having a very different experience of this conversation, yet we're all in the same conversation. It's so fascinating. So, I mean, I'm probably going to call you after this and we can talk about that for hours.
Yeah, that would be fun. But it even go. So we're all three wearing black shirts. You know, how do you find that black is the one that you're going? How would we align to that? You know, we all show up with this. You know, with this. How do you define why you would wear a black shirt on a podcast? And there are really consistent themes throughout all of it.
No doubt. Okay, so I have obvious assumptions, but I want to hear your words. You ended up researching partnerships, which the whole reason we started this podcast was we have seen at work time and time again that the basis of good business is good relationships. So your research, your understanding of what makes humans tick, how has this impacted your role in business and partnerships?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, so my first role out of university was with a company that had an entrepreneur and president and CEO, and he was doing a bunch of he was running a research company, and we found ourselves one time at a client in Austin, and he started talking, and the guy just didn't know when to shut up, I guess, because he got himself so in such hot water with this client, and I recognized that this guy was causing problems for the rest of us, and so I stepped in and I kind of bailed him out and managed to explain what he had non-eloquently tried to suggest to these folks, and that that he wasn't just trying to offend them, and some things like that. And we dropped him off at the airport later, and he said, "I'm giving you a raise," and then later said, and we're going to make you a VP of the company. And it really it was entirely about relationships, and it was entirely about trying to have this guy's back even in his worst moment, and
being able to probably read the person as well and understand like where he was starting to go mentally, or
and you quickly with the background that I had, I quickly realized that that relationship, even though it wasn't always really positive or wasn't always really outstanding, it had an impact on myself personally, and it set me up as a VP when I was in my 20s. Right, I was probably only 26 years old, and I've kept that through the entire rest of my career. Right, and it was just this one moment where having some guy's back in a tough situation managed to impact me for the rest of my life. And you quickly realize then after that, when you start working with clients and things, that if you've got their backs and you make them look good, and you're more concerned about what their experience is than what your own experience is, then they'll come back and come back and come back, and they'll keep doing things with you because they like working with you.
Yeah, I love that. So it's really about knowing what makes people tick, and really being able to operate from a place of empathy to really have their back and help drive their success forward through whatever venture you're involved in.
Yeah, that's exactly.
I kind of want to take a little step back to what we were talking about earlier around what makes people tick. I'd like to, what are a few of those things that you learned early on, right, and that you use to this day that actually make people tick?
Yeah, there are a few life mantras that I've stuck to as a result of those early things. One of them, and I also learned this from my blue collar dad, right? It's that you should be the most obvious solution. And if you combine that with empathy, then people will work with you and come to you even if they know that they don't really know if you've got the answer, because they'll say, well, what do you think about this, and your answer might be, I don't know much about that, but I do know someone that does know about that, and let me get you in touch with them, and then then you can make their lives a little bit easier. And then sometimes you just know, right? And you're able to kind of help them in a way that that sort of makes their lives easier. And as a result of that, it makes your life easier.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so be the most obvious solution.
Mm-hmm.
What else have you learned that makes people tick?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that sometimes people don't jump in enough. We're all hardcore Westerners, right? Like family and country and I don't mean that in the big sense, but like literally the land and the things that you kind of grow up learning in those environments are things like jump in and just get it done, even if you don't really know at the beginning. You'll start to figure things out as you kind of move in and start to do it. And in the worst of all terms, I call it faking it until fake it till you make it. But there's some reality in that. You just have to get after it sometimes. And if you combine that with if you combine that sort of approach with an unwillingness to fail, then you can make for some real progress, even if it's not always linear.
Yeah, I really like that. Jason and I talk about that a lot, how even like for personal projects or definitely professional, it's like some people, myself included, sometimes get so hung up on like, well, I don't know the final step or what this is going to look like at the end, but no one does until you like take that first step and just start trying. That's when things start to happen for you. And that's where people start to pick up on like, they're hard workers. They're going to show up. They're going to have my back. And that's kind of the key.
Yep.
One thing you said too, I was listening to another podcast a while back, and it was super interesting. It was Neil Pajrika, and he was talking about how in today's leaders, the most missing key point is empathy. And it's super interesting because empathy is not really something you can teach. In his perspective, he was saying that actually the best way to become more empathetic or learn empathy is to read fiction, because it's the one place where you can like be in somebody else's shoes truly and like picture the world that way. But this has been brought up many times here in your conversation. So do you think
that's really funny?
Empathy can be taught, and do you think that's something that's lacking in today's world?
I think it is lacking. You can see a lot of background noise, and you always hear about trolls and different things like that on the, folks that just exist to try to make people's online lives miserable. I mean, I don't think that we would be doing that to each other if we had a certain level of empathy. But you know what? True. You know what my favorite books and TV to watch is? Zombie movies and books. It's horrible, but there's something I find interesting when the entire world and all of society breaks down and crumbles down around us, and it's that notion of fiction and empathy is really interesting. I'd not really thought about that too much, but I think you're probably right. It's pretty easy to put yourself in those types of situations and try to think about, well, what is that character doing and how would I act personally in that? Would I be the guy, in the zombie apocalypse that would be helping, or would I be running to hope that the guy next behind me was the one that got eaten?
Right.
But
yeah. Would you be the one trying to save your body and really lead to survival?
Yeah, I really like that. That's really cool.
So are you a Last of Us fan?
Yeah, that was pretty sweet. And I'm the one person in the entire country that's watched every episode of The Walking Dead.
Yeah, I think you might be. I quit after about season 6.
Yeah. It went on a long time. But
it did.
Yeah.
All right, so we're digressing. We'll move on from here. So I want to know about sort of your career. You're a reformed CRO who's now SVP partnerships. How'd you end up in partnerships coming from a CRO role, and how's your experience as CRO influencing your role now?
It's funny that Sam just mentioned, the whole leadership thing and how some of those guys lack empathy. I kind of feel like the organizations that I've enjoyed most have been the ones where you had an empathic leader, and I feel like I've got that in my current CEO. It's quite interesting, but I think that I got a view from, I've always been sort of around the sales and marketing area, former president and some things. And so I stepped into my previous role to the one I'm in now, to do research. Basically, they hired me as the channel-based, research-based consultant for their organization. And I was leading a team of those folks. And when they started realizing, because they were PE funded and they needed to sell a few years later, when they started realizing that they needed to hire a CRO and that the PE company needed them to do that, I went to them and said, there's some things you don't know about me. You know about this research side of what I do, but I've actually been in this PE environment and I've, led companies and things like that. And you should put me in that position. And,
nice.
Faking it till you make it, right? They put me in the position, and, after 7 interviews, they actually were convinced that I probably would be the person for the job. I'm not sure.
You knew what made him tick. You could speak to him.
They were completely convinced, but it ended up working out pretty well for me. But in those leadership type roles, the thing that you've got to be really careful about is being so hyper revenue focused, because everything that you report to almost is revenue metrics. And it's, are you going to get enough sales? Are you going to get enough closes? Does your pipeline look strong enough? Blah, 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 blah. And the fortunate thing for me in that position is that I had the partnerships person in our business reporting up into me, and she was impactful, and I liked her, and I loved working with her, and she was funny, and she had these great relationships, and I thought, when I moved past this, which I inevitably did, that's where I want to be. I want to be having relationships, and I want to work with other partners that I enjoy spending time with. I am a little bit on the last third of my career, and why not make it something that I enjoy instead of sitting around and microanalyzing pipeline for the last third of my career. So there it is.
That's fascinating. So you had a head of partnerships reporting to you as the CRO. She was providing so much impact. You really liked the work that she was getting to do that you decided, what the hell, I'm going to go do it myself.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
That's amazing.
And the business that I'm in, I think he probably needed another. Well, he would say he's not gray haired, but I think he probably needed another gray hair in the business just to help him. In what he was doing as he tried to scale up his own business, and I do have some background in that area, so that didn't hurt.
Yeah, and I would imagine now in your role at Mindmatrix, you find yourself talking to a lot of other programs and helping them build out some level of strategy. How does that experience as CRO play into that to help them better understand how to drive revenue, how to build effective relationships, and teach them what makes people tick?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's no substitute sometimes for experience and having seen a lot of things from a lot of different vantage points. And the going back around to that relationship stuff, when you walk into the room and you understand the pain that they're experiencing, and you're in it yourself, and you're trying to drive opportunity for businesses and things like that. Trust is so important, right? Because at the end of the day, there are so many platforms and so many features and things like that you can talk about, but they all start to blend together. And so it really comes to someone saying, no, this really will do what you're hoping to accomplish. And because you and I trust each other, I've got your back, and we'll figure out how to make that work. And then it moves forward. And a lot of that comes from just the experience at the CRO level, experience in the research, experience in the different things that we do.
So I want to go back really quick. You mentioned this a while ago, how when you're one of these top leaders in an organization, you have to be really careful not to be solely focused on revenue, which that's what grows the business. That's the bottom line. That's what investors are looking for. That's what we get paid on. So it's really difficult to not do that. But you've also talked a lot about trust and relationships, and those three things need to play really well together, but they can also come into conflict. Again, we're coming back to empathy. Like if we're talking about revenue, sometimes, especially in a partner seat, it's really easy to like, what's in it for me and my company? So how do you find a balance between building trust and building these relationships while still keeping revenue in mind as a leader?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I first took on the partnership stuff that I was doing as the chief revenue officer, my initial response, even though I was with a company that all we did was service the channel and partnerships, right? Like I knew this stuff. I'd been consulting on it. I'd been talking to people about it. But even stepping into that role, my very first thought was, well, is this additive to our revenue? And I mean, like it was sort of a harsh reality, right? It's like, should she be spending that much time on this thing that we call partnerships? And as it moved along, you start to understand that partnerships thing, the easiest sell to a CEO is the 25 to 40% incremental revenue that you're going to get from a partnership ecosystem, right? That's why they do it. It's why they double down on it. It's almost entirely revenue driven. But when you get past that and actually start to do the implementation of that, if your hyper focus is all about the revenue, then you won't get the loyalty that you need out of the folks. So when you've got vendors that are pulling at the partner's time, right? And each of them has 5 partners that that are sitting on their line card, but those 5 each have 3 competitors, let's say. 15 different organizations, you can't service 15 different organizations. So the revenue becomes more about, and the loyalty becomes more about the relationship than it actually becomes about the revenue. And so if you're providing the baseline revenue as a partner or to them as a vendor, and that relationship exists, that loyalty and that connection cements, and they'll go with you even when, from a financial standpoint, it may not make as much sense as it would have. And they're more likely to tell you, oh, something's not working quite right here, or this competitor of yours just undermined your bid. Can you match it, or what can you do for me? And so you end up with these discussions as opposed to binary, as opposed to the binary yes or no, thing that goes on. And it all becomes about that understanding of what they're going through and trying to make their lives a little bit easier.
Yeah, love that. And this whole conversation kind of reminds me of a piece that I remember that you wrote on the Partner Hacker blog around when you first got started working in partnerships. right? That you kind of only cared about, how you could use partners to grow revenue, but you learned over time, and you found out that the role of partners is much more complex than that.
Mm-hmm.
So like this kind of sounds like that journey. So like I'm very curious to know, like, when you first got in and that you started to understand that complexity, like what did that journey look like for you to begin to kind of break down your old school ways of thinking?
Yeah, it starts to become about other KPIs, right? That lead into the things that actually drive success or eventually lead to revenue in your organization. And it instead of let's just use brand for instance. I used to do a bunch of marketing research, and people struggle from a branding standpoint. There are a lot of companies that have really good brand, and the ones, particularly the newer ones, often struggle to get their brand out there.
Yeah.
Well, it's a lack of exposure. So when you start to think about how you can you can move the needle on your branding activities, which inevitably lead to outcomes for a to positive revenue outcomes. The thing that you need is someone that can actually say, "Hey, these guys do a pretty dang good job, and we like them, and we trust them." And they'll talk about that. I mean, the whole reason that in the research world they kicked off Net Promoter Score, which is really, it's used a lot in business to kind of drive success metrics, but the fundamental piece of that is all about loyalty and evangelism. Well,
Yeah.
the reason that matters is that a good story will often move the needle better than anything else. And when you start to evangelize, how else are you going to evangelize your brand? You can put your ads out on LinkedIn or on Google and whatnot, and people might run across them, but eventually someone's got to say, these guys do a pretty good job, and they really are all right. And it's better when it comes from a partner.
Exactly. And I guess what we're saying here is you're finding the partner team, partner person to be the best evangelist for the company to begin to establish that trust and that loyalty to those other companies.
Yeah, and the reach is better. I mean, it's funny that it's hard because on one hand I've got this like humanist in me that sits on the shoulder and talks about things that are, better for the world, and then on the other side I've got this analyst in me that just always falls back to what are the stats. you know and trying to juggle between those isn't always the easiest.
Which
You're
which one
seeing
wins more
you're
often?
seeing my bipolar dilemma actually as it comes out real time in this podcast.
Okay, so that's like a perfect segue because I wanted to ask you about this quote I saw from you that humanity is messy and helping others clean up the mess is motivating. And so you just kind of you led me into this perfectly, but um we're always talking about how we can make partnerships a repeatable motion and really drive predictable results. But as we've said time and time again, at the foundation, we're relationship builders and
Yeah.
relationships are with humans. So that
Uh-huh.
can be messy. So,
Yeah.
how do you find the middle ground? KPIs don't necessarily capture all of that. And as you've just said, it's trust and it's loyalty and it's story that's driving things forward. So, how do we as partner leaders capitalize on that while still creating a
Mhm.
repeatable motion? And, which shoulder wins for you? How do you balance that?
Well, I really try to. One of the reasons I'm in partnerships is to try to, you know, like that against the person that's sitting on that metric shoulder. But it's funny because when you start talking about happiness and some of these things, that really are indicative of good life, right? The Some of the biggest key indicators of happiness are never really ever wrapped around money and how much money people are making. It's the psychologist in me goes back to hierarchy of needs and things like that. And once those needs are met, then you can move on to the more actualized things in your life. And the research on this, they start to find is that when you're serving other people, your happiness levels go up.
Mm-hmm.
And why would that not apply in business the same way that it applies in the rest of our lives? It's interesting, right? I mean, because a lot of times it's not necessarily applied quite so easily, but when people aren't entirely acting out of revenue generating practice, right? I mean, money is interesting. Businesses if anyone ever forgets, businesses are there to make money.
Mm-hmm.
That's their sole purpose, but if we've learned nothing from the younger generations coming into the workforce, it's that there should be a balance between making money and enjoying these other things that go on in our lives. And they're supporting brands that give back. And that's a key level of support for those types of things. Well, partnerships just do that same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, they're providing an avenue for organizations to make more money, but to do it in sort of a way that's multi-directional. It's not just one person trying to serve one person's needs.
Okay, so I am fully on board with everything you just said. I think we both are. How?
Yep.
I mean, I think there's a reality in the world right now too, though, that partner teams are getting slashed left and right. Layoffs are happening. That's a really good feel-good story, and we know at our core that it's true. How do we get revenue leaders and the people who are at businesses to make money to follow along with that and understand that it takes time and it's not linear? How do we get everybody on the same page?
Well, this is funny because the platforms like the one that not to plug the Mindmatrix platform, but the platforms like this, what they're doing is they're increasing the productivity, and they're increasing the automation, and they're increasing all of these things that make that easier, right? That you can actually make more money as a result of these platforms being in place. So the key to that is showing the return on investment, right? Because you do end up having to jump onto the KPI and metrics side of things. You have to show the leadership that the investment is going to turn something really positive, and that it follows. I mean, there are some of the biggest organizations that that claim to be 100% partner led. Most of the partnership organizations are probably generating 25 to 40% incremental revenue.
Mm-hmm.
That's more than you would get for hiring a bunch of new direct sellers.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got to have the infrastructure in place that allows that thing to happen. And when they do that, unfortunately, you can use some of that in cases to decrease the number of people that actually need to be involved with a certain process, because when automation works, it does that. But for those that are supporting those environments, though, what those sorts of platforms do is they tell when someone's raising their hand, hey, I need help. Right. And it comes down to that it's easier to see when they're raising their hands. It's easier to see what they're raising their hands about, and it's easier to see how to help them. Now, that doesn't answer the question about slashing partnership budgets and things like that. I don't know how to solve that problem, because at the end of the day, these organizations are reporting up to shareholders and boards and things like that they're acting because they're required to act. right? I mean, would they choose to slash partnerships? Probably not. But when it comes to that sort of activity, they have to report to the shareholders, and so you end up having to act according to the KPIs, right? And
Mm-hmm.
at that point it becomes equal opportunist. It doesn't matter who it is. You're trying to get to a specific line in the sand, and it's the only way there.
Yeah, it's kind of tough because you just mentioned like it requires an infrastructure, and as you know, like building any sort of infrastructure requires time. And I think a lot of CROs want to see a path to profitability like now, last
Yeah.
week, right? You
Yeah.
got 1 quarter, but really that's not enough time. Like in
Mm-mm.
all actuality, like a year may not be enough time in some cases, right? And so like
Yeah.
if this were a a CRO podcast, what would Vaughn say to the CROs listening to allow for that infrastructure to take time to build? And like what are you telling to companies right now working as a partner technology?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting sales heuristic. It typically takes a lot of the sales guys, if you're a direct seller, it takes about 6 months to get those
Mm-hmm.
folks moving, right? To get
Right.
them to a point where they start to build their own pipeline. My first question would be, why would this be any different? If that
And
partnership motion doesn't exist,
yeah,
right? Then why would it in 1 year, how do you feel like you're going to build out the proper motion? Is that going to happen in 6 months? If you think it's going to take only 6 months, then there's your starting point. You're at least 6 months further down the line to get those sellers, activated.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, the
And
6-month ramp time, that's assuming there's already a pipeline in
mhm,
motion. So
yeah,
for partner
yeah,
teams to build from the ground up, yeah, you're
yeah. Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, when folks step in, I think they almost always do it because they need that 25 to 40% incremental revenue. It's very, very predictive, right? Organizations get into partnerships, uh, they grow their business through direct sales, and then somewhere around, depends, I mean, 100 to 200 million, they start to realize, okay, I've got a lot of direct sellers here, and either we can keep hiring all of these direct sellers, or we can actually get partnerships in play that drive, triple the head count with, that could drive 25 to 40% incremental revenue without all of the additional headcount
mm-hmm.
additions. So, but then what they do is they say, okay, we're going to do it. We're going to ramp this up. And they go, 15%, you're going to get 15% on this. And then you walk into the room and you say, we've got a partner program. See, it exists on our it exists on our website. And they say, well, okay, what materials exist? And oftentimes they don't exist, or maybe one does, or they've reskinned something from the direct sellers, and then it ends up with a situation where there are very few value propositions to those folks. And so to the rev ops or the CRO, invest the time to make this correct, to do it right.
Yeah.
And it's probably going to take in the 1 to 2 year mark to really get
Yeah.
that thing
Absolutely.
ramped up to where you start to see the impact of it. But I mean, if the top organizations in our industry are any, leading indicator, so these folks are 100% partnership driven,
Yep.
and they're making a lot of money doing it.
Yeah.
It's the
absolutely.
classic go slow to go fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast.
Yep.
So you're somebody who spends a lot of times with partner people, partner programs. What are you seeing right now from these programs, and like in particular, like where are you seeing partner programs struggle today, and where they could use the most kind of help to push forward?
I think actually it might be more associated with the people than it is the programs. There's there's a growing divide between the channel, right? People talking about the channel, which has a tendency to be the hardware vendors, is the ones that use that term, and the partnerships folks, which have a tendency to be more oriented towards the software vendors and the MSPs. Now, the majority of those jobs, or a large proportion of those jobs, exist on the channel side, and and people have a tendency to kind of move from from the roles in about a 2 or 3 year block now,
Right.
so they're not sticking around quite as much. I think that growing divide between the partnerships side and the channel side is going to start creating some of the bigger challenges that we'll see in the industry as it kind of moves forward, because the channel folks aren't necessarily embracing the best practices of the partnerships people, and the partnerships people just think the channel folks are old. And it's so how do these organizations stay highly relevant in this
Right.
sort of world that jumps around like that? And there's a real need for some really solid training that kind of bridges that gap, because people spend a lot of time on their partner programs themselves, making them really good, especially after they get past their initial ramp up phase. And they always have good examples by looking at some of the top ones that exist. And things like Partnership Leaders, for instance, has a really good resource for folks that just need best practices from other folks that look like them. And I think that's really cool. But the channel folks aren't sitting in there, and they have a lot to teach. Actually, I've spent a lot of time with them. They've got a lot to teach, but they're not always accessible to the folks on the other end that are kind of sitting in that microcosm of partnerships.
Yeah, and I think a good solve to that, and that's not the answer I expected, but I think a good solve to that comes back to just community, right? How do you bring, channel into tech, into alliances, and that whole partnership, and bring them all together, especially if you're all under the same, company umbrella? Like, how do you build a community with all those partners, whether
Yeah.
it's channel, tech, alliances, whatever you might call it, and really treat it as such and provide necessary materials, resources, events, etc., for that, to bring that whole group together and thrive as one community. Because chances are that channel is probably working with some of those tech partners already. So
Yep.
getting those teams talking and coexisting will only provide, added benefit to the company.
Yeah, I like the idea of better together, and it gets triangulated across a lot of. It means a lot of things, really, when it comes down to it. And you're right. I mean, when you start looking at the personas that people are struggling to try to figure out. I mean, you've got influencers now that are impacting deals, and you've got alliance partners, and there are attribution questions, and all of this stuff. And then you've got channel tech platforms that are even, they're helping, but they're at the same time, they're not all. I mean, the most recent Canalys thing had,
I was about to say the same.
It was huge number of channels tech companies that were sitting in there.
Keeps getting bigger every year.
Yeah, it was a little. It's really cool information, but a little overwhelming. And it's how do you bring them all together is a really good question, because I mean, one of the ways is through these channel tech platforms, but when you get to the point at which we've got this emerging view that there are public ecosystems and private ecosystems, and they're all going on at once. Okay, the public ones that are the ones that they're more visible. It might be one vendor working with another vendor. And then you've got these private ecosystems that are happening behind the scenes that are sort of like my ecosystem versus the ecosystem, right? And when you get into that view of my ecosystem, you can build those relationships and the back and forths and stuff, but sometimes that becomes a bit of a microcosm that only wraps around that thing, and there's still a lot to learn from other people outside of my ecosystem that are coming from the larger ecosystem.
Yeah, and Jason and I actually talk about this a lot too. I think that's super interesting because we do a lot of our business via text or LinkedIn, people to people, and it's not like, it's not obvious. It's not tracked in our CRM. So then when it shows up like, you know, a BDR and he's like, I got the account. And it's like, actually, there's all this that's been going on in the background, and it's just part of the deal. But that's where rubber meets the road. So,
but that right there is the best example for why relationships matter.
No doubt.
Absolutely.
It's the 80% that happens before anyone picks up the phone or someone shoots an email saying, I think I might need to know more, unfortunately.
Yeah. That is it. So, Vaughn, we're going to wrap it up here because we're coming up on time and we want to be respectful of your time. But this, as I said, I have so many more questions for you, and I so appreciate your perspective on this stuff. So we like to close the show.
We're going to have to get together next time you're in Bozeman.
Yes, for real. Next time,
continue the conversation.
Next time it's too hot in Phoenix. Come on up.
There you go. My next travel to Canada.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we like to close with a question that's not really related to partnerships, but more so the guest. So as mentioned, you have 7 grandchildren, which is a lot. What's your favorite activity to do with them?
Ooh, lately we've been doing some rock climbing. That's been fun.
Dang.
Fun.
Yeah, that's been a lot of cool times. We go to Disney a lot.
Okay.
Yeah,
it's a lot of kids take to Disney if you're taking all at the same time.
Yeah, you know how that goes. You might not, but there are 7 kids, and it goes like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's walking around the park counting to 7 like over and over and over again to make sure
Where's
everyone
number 5?
is in one spot at one time. You ignore the adults completely, and you just make sure you haven't lost a child.
Nice.
I was gonna say, having 7 at Disney sounds like a lot to keep track of.
It does sound like that. I feel like you've got to like almost put them in numbered T-shirts, like 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, it's almost like a horde. You start to wonder why people wear matching T-shirts at Disney. It has nothing to do with their Disney. They're enamored with Disney. It's entirely organization.
Yes.
I never thought of it that way, but I think you're onto something there. Well, Vaughn, truly, thank you. Really appreciate your perspective on humanity and how it plays into everything we do from a business perspective and a personal perspective. So really appreciate you joining the show. We'll be in touch for sure for more conversation. But that's it for now, friends. We'll see you next time.